Thanks, Scott. So, hello, everybody. Welcome. David Fawcett. Um, as usual with these webinars, I'm going to introduce a topic, talk about it for a little while, and people are welcome to comment on that or ask questions about that or anything else regarding addiction Q&A, because we really try to be as broad as possible on this particular webinar and really provide information that you need. So wherever you want to go, we're ready. This idea of embracing change, there's a lot of change in my life lately, and so change is always something I've been relatively uncomfortable with. I like kind of stability and everything the same, and routine that could probably, I think it was Rob Weiss, or someone said recently, and I loved it, that sobriety and recovery is just this side of boring. And for me, it's really great because boring is kind of good, as in lack of drama, addictive drama. However, I do like excitement and all kinds of things like that too. But there's a thing about change that I sometimes resist. So there's a great book I like called by Martha Beck called Finding Your Own North Star. And the point of the book is really about gaining purpose in your life. And it's an excellent book. But I like the themes in there she talks about with change and embracing change. And she identified 4 kind of change styles. So I'm going to start with those and just see if any of these get familiar. The first one she identifies is called the Chaos Commando. And the Chaos Commando is someone who loves change, but gets easily bored and doesn't follow through. And so I have a friend who spring cleaning, decided he was going to do a deep clean of his house and get rid of stuff, and emptied out all his closets all over the floor and got bored and didn't follow through. So now he has stuff everywhere, all these kind of projects half started. Now he's living with a lot of chaos. And the idea of change was appealing, but the follow through is not so good. And I think that probably is representative of other areas of his life where he starts things and doesn't finish. So the second one she talks about is the big dreamer, but the little doer. So what that means is somebody who really visualizes incredibly well, but can't necessarily translate it into action. So these are the idea people, the people that are kind of constantly coming up with creative solutions, but sometimes have trouble, I guess, to put it in kind of Eastern Hindu process, they'd have trouble manifesting that vision, but they're great at coming up with it. The third one she talks about is a realist, not an idealist. That I like her description, but it doesn't capture it for me. But what she means by that is someone who falls in love with someone else's vision and kind of makes it real or just adopts it as their own. And I think there are a lot of people like that too, that don't necessarily come up with a lot of original things sometimes, but they really get on board with other people's. And sometimes those people that adopt it have the ability to really translate things into great action. So that's the third. And then the fourth is what she calls the Rock of Gibraltar, which, as you might imagine, is very predictable settings, really solid, stable, but just can't adjust to new situations. Things are too kind of overwhelming and threatening. Those are really obviously 4 generalizations, but I think it's kind of useful to think about what our own personal change style is and how that works. And I somewhere in between the big dreamer and the Rock of Gibraltar, I think, because I like stability, I like place, I like routine, but after a while I do get bored and intermixed with that is a lot of ideas. So anyway, we all have our own styles and probably blends of those different generalizations that she talked about, but thought that'd be kind of an interesting way to open. What I want to do is just talk about a little bit about change and then talk about this, we have the stages of grief. I think there's kind of stages of change that are useful for me, at least when I go through new changes. But so change is difficult, change is predictable, right? Everybody's life changes and change just keeps on going. But it can be really distressing. It can, especially if we have a history of addiction or if we love an addict where there's a lot of change, unintentional change and drama and conflict and difficult things. Change is sometimes threatening and can be triggering in and of itself, even if the change is something good. So I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but good stressors like the birth of a baby or a marriage or a promotion, all that stuff is just as stressful as losing a spouse or a relapse or losing a job. So it's good change, but it still takes a toll. So it can cause alienation, confusion, frustration, all kinds of difficult emotions, and even really acute distress. We know that trauma is really acutely intertwined with addiction, and sometimes change, depending on how it comes about, can really trigger some reactions, strong reactions that are really difficult to manage for people. So I always honor someone's personal experience of change. I think one of the worst things we can do is kind of minimize the difficulty someone might have in adjusting. I'm not walking in their shoes, and something may be easy for me and difficult for somebody else. Something may be extremely easy for somebody else, and I find it really challenging. So I think it's really important to kind of understand that there's no really right way, like there is no right way to grieve. There's different ways to do it. I think change is something we all have to learn how to adapt with. So going back to Martha Beck, she talks about three types of change and how they occur. The first is what she calls shock. And these are changes that occur outside of us, right? So that can be the death of a spouse. That can be a medical issue. It can be the loss of a job. It can, anything outside of us that kind of is a source of change, and probably one of the more distressing sources of change. So that's the first, the shock that occurs outside of us. The second is opportunity. And these are good changes. These are what we might call a lucky break. These are things that open up, doorways that open up for us, things that come along, that we find ourselves at a crossroads where we can really maybe take advantage of something that comes our way. We catch a break, which sometimes as addicts, I think we feel we don't often get. And then the third one she identifies is what she calls transition. And this is really this, I think, typical of recovery to some extent, but it's a slow internal process of growth where we experiencing a slow development of ideas, maybe a spark, maybe a creative spark that turns into something we get interested in, which turns into a habit, which can turn into an occupation. So it's a slow, I think rather pleasant evolution of change in our lives that happens in an organic way and also can be quite a positive one. So those are the three types of change she classifies. I think there's others, but I like her classification because of things that happen from outside of us through shock, things that also happen outside of us but present really an opportunity, and things that are more internal and evolve from within. So the other thing I want to mention tonight with these kind of 4 stages of embracing change that she talks about. And the first, no matter how good the change is, how welcome the change is, there's always this kind of idea of resetting and going back to square one. And so, especially if it's that shock kind of change where it's something that's imposed on us from outside, usually negative, but it can be good shock too. There's this belief that there's a grief process that we have to let go of what was. And there's this kind of transition phase between what the situation was before and the change that we're experiencing now. And sometimes we can tell ourselves, everything I knew was wrong, everything I knew was gone, it's all meaningless. And there's this like hopeless feeling sometimes that can set in with this grief. And I think at that point, it's really important to kind of assess the change, get a lot of support from our friends and sponsors and support groups, and really help us reassess what's happening and kind of reframe it. There may be something that's happened to us that really presents a great opportunity, but I'm just seeing it as a really painful choice or a stressful event. And it may take my sponsor or my friends or my husband to come to me and say, gee, look, that's all true, but this is the upside of that. This might happen, or that's a possibility. And so sometimes I get stuck in my own head and need that outside input to help me reframe whatever the change is. And then the second one, if I can kind of buy into it a little bit, I start to enter into imagining the possibilities of this change. And so that's where skills like visualizing, paying attention, being mindful, really cultivating your inner vision, that sense of purpose, really comes in. So, asking yourself questions like, wouldn't it be nice if, thinking in those terms, or I would love to, ... In therapy, in therapy called motivational interviewing, there's this thing called the miracle question, which I really like, where people, a client is asked, gee, if you woke up tomorrow and all your barriers were solved, you had all the money in the world, you didn't have physical illness, whatever the problems are, they were just gone, what would you do with your life? And it's a way to help people kind of jump over the hurdles we have that kind of keep us limited. It's a way of breaking through the limitations in our imagination. And I think that exercise is really good too, to get in that habit of just kind of letting ourselves daydream and play and imagine. Kids are born with the ability to imagine, and we kind of early on get that kind of beaten out of us by following rules and being rigid and learning the right way, and everything's black and white. And I think that ability to reconnect with our imagination is huge. So that's, I think, an essential step in embracing change. And then once there's a vision, once there's kind of a plan, that's where the nuts and bolts piece, and that's the third phase, really. And that's where we had one of those people that were big dreamers but could never translate it into reality. The nuts and bolts phase is where we put those plans into action. It requires flexibility, it requires persistence, it requires resilience. Scott and I are involved in this amazing and wonderful venture at Seeking Integrity, but it's required adaptation, right? Because we have an idea where we think, gee, this would be a great idea, and then in reality, it's more complicated, or we actually see a better way. It would be better if we by Z. And so this thing is growing, and it's a really exciting and sometimes frustrating process of growth, like any change. And so this idea of change has really been on my mind, because I'm kind of living it in a way that I avoided for many years in my kind of stable and somewhat boring existence. So I'm certainly not bored now. So living in the change. And then finally, after the nuts and bolts, after things are in place, after this constant adaptation and reworking and rewiring, and it takes just maintenance and monitoring. It's not enough to just set a great plan in place. To use the example of my friend who emptied out all his closets, if he were to put everything back in his closets, get it nice and neat, but if he never does anything to maintain those, by next spring, he's going to have to do it all over again. And so I think if we do go to this great effort sometimes to create change, we really have to be able to adapt and maintain it and be self-aware enough to see if it's working or not. And maybe other change will be required. In fact, I guarantee probably other change will be required. So that's my 2 cents on change and embracing it. I think it's something we all have to live with. I think for addicts it's particularly difficult because it seems threatening, and I think it's a challenge, at least it was for me, to stay grounded, especially in early recovery. And so change just meant I was all something else to deal with, and I was all in a tizzy. So learning how to manage it is really important. So I think I'll stop there. Scott, if you have any thoughts, and we'll open it up for questions or comments or whatever.
Well, I can't help but thinking when I was new to recovery, I was informed that I only needed to change 3 things: people, places, and things, which is everything. I had to change my whole life. And I was resistant. Everything I let go of in my early recovery had claw marks all over it, because I was just digging in and fighting it. And, once in a while, my guilty TV pleasure for me is hoarders. And, these people are very resistant to change. They know their house is a mess. They know that there are roaches and cat feces and all the other crazy things, and they're in trouble with the city, and they have $100,000 in fines, and they're about to get condemned, and they're going to be homeless. But making change for some reason is scarier than all of that stuff, and changing, walking away from an addiction. And I personally think hoarding is an addiction. Or close enough.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard. There's a lot of resistance, and you use the word grief. It's stage 1 of addiction. You have to let go of something that's been with you for a long time. And it's hard. It's scary. And I like the 4 stages. I like the second stage, imagining the possibilities. I think every alcoholic in the world is very good at imagining possibilities while seated on a bar stool on drink 7. But there's never a nuts and bolts plan, and there's never any follow through. I mean, that's how we live our lives as addicts. I was going to write a novel, for 30 years. It never happened. I got sober. I wrote a novel. It's like, oh. But I had to, let go of what I'd been hanging on to that was holding me back so much. So this is a great topic.
I think I didn't really mention this before, but the feeling underneath that, or the emotion, really for me at least, was fear. And I kind of heard that in what you just shared too. Fear, anxiety about letting go. And it's that the hoarders is a great example, because I was in tremendous pain, emotional pain and physical pain in my addiction, but it was familiar pain. Right, and I chose that over the uncertainty of recovery for a couple of years, which was ridiculous. But I was afraid of giving up my alcohol for one thing, but I was also afraid of what might happen in recovery. I didn't know what to expect, and it was really kind of taking a leap of faith in a way. So I really I empathize with people who are on the threshold of stepping into recovery or not, because it's right now, looking back, it seems like such an obvious choice and the perfect choice for me to have made. But I remember the struggle I had with it of, at least I know this misery, God knows what misery lies in that, down those church steps, in that point. So yeah, but I think the fear and the anxiety really is a huge piece of it.
Yeah, and one of the things I was afraid of was if I didn't have my addiction, what was I going to do with myself? I was spending more time drinking, using, and acting out sexually than I was working. It was a full-time job and then some. How do I fill that 50 or 60 hours a week that I'm throwing at this? Because it was 8 or 10 hours a day. I think of hoarders. What are they going to do with their life if they don't have this hoard? As horrible as it is, and as horrible as my addiction was, it was the only thing in my life, and to walk away from that was very scary. And you talk about the nuts and bolts plan. Well, what is the nuts and bolts plan? What do I do, with suddenly all this free time? And thankfully I had people to walk me through it, and they'd say, well, is your bed made? No, go make your bed and call me back. This went on for months.
And I think that's a really good point too. I think in early recovery, it was all I could do to focus on one day at a time, right? And not to have this sort of grand scheme and figure out my life, the next stage of my life in the first year of recovery. It was all I could do to stay sober. And so I think timing is everything for this idea of embracing change. Change is going to happen. I think we have to kind of roll with it and trust and have faith in early recovery. But this idea of, at least for me, I couldn't have, first of all, come up with a very good plan for myself, and then I certainly didn't have the tools to implement it. I had to be sort of told by my sponsor, what meetings to go to, because I was so overwhelmed with, I lived in New York City. There were like 6 meetings in the Upper West Side every night. Like And I remember literally being in tears one night, calling my sponsor because I couldn't figure out which one to go to. So I was not in the best of shape, I guess, to put the nuts and bolts of my new life into place. But I think there does come a point in recovery or in any issue where that does become necessary.
So by the way, everybody, feel free to ask questions about this aspect of recovery or any other aspect you want to talk about. Use the Q&A feature. That's the easy way. But David, what about people new to recovery are always told no major changes in the first year. How does that reconcile with making a major change?
Right. I totally agree with that. And that's really built on years of experience of people. So I think those major changes are where that's the equivalent to me of my friend who emptied out all his closets. I think in early recovery, we can take all this stuff and start to throw it out and get rid of it and clean house and overdo it. And later either have found ourselves beyond our capacity to deal with all the change we've started, or it's just not a change we would make once we have a little more recovery under our belt. Or it may not be the time, because timing is also important for these kind of changes. So I think, those kind of major changes that are real life disrupting changes are something we really have to kind of be cautious about and avoid ideally. There will be enough change on its own without us creating change. Now, to go back to those styles where the change emerges from inside or outside, I think what people in early recovery are experiencing are a lot of changes that are imposed from the outside, and new ways of living, new ways of being, sometimes lots of empty time and boredom, like you said, and how to fill that and what to do with our lives. And all that is change enough, I think, to just really embrace and try to live with. I believe once our lives have some sense of stability, that's when we can start to make some major decisions, like do we want to stay in this marriage, or do we want to move to the other coast, or change a job, or go back to school, or all that stuff that are potentially great ideas and maybe important or life-saving ideas, but it's timing on those things. And just too many people early on have made all those changes and just created much more havoc and chaos in their life, and really jeopardize their sobriety by doing that. Because at least, and I'll speak again for myself, I was just incapable of pulling off any kind of major change. It was literally, like I said, it was all I could do to kind of do my basic activities of daily living, and function. So it takes time.
I think change can be, we've mostly been talking about change in terms of addicts. Change can be hard for partners as well. When the addict gets sober or enters recovery, life changes, and that's a very external change. And no matter how much the partner or spouse or whoever wants that change, I think it can be really difficult. Can you talk a little bit about that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, it's a huge, in fact, I think for the partners, it's almost more dramatic, because it's the reason for the change is not a medical illness like addiction, but something their loved one has done. And it's much easier, I think, to have all kinds of emotional reactions to that situation, from anger and fury to really care and concern and love and compassion and just everything a partner does, as they do with any medical concern, to sort of manage what's happening. But I think that kind of imposed change on the partner can really be difficult, because there's a sense, I think, of powerlessness, as there is in any change, but particularly in that scenario. And that's why I think the great kind of antidote to some of the stress from that is getting a support network in place where people can give feedback, and some of the feelings and changes can be normalized just by hearing the experiences of other people. Because I think everybody, partners and addicts, all are pretty convinced that they and the other are crazy at that moment, and we probably are. But I think sometimes that all that craziness is kind of normal. And I think it was for me, at least, it was very reassuring as an addict to realize a lot of the craziness I was having was kind of just routine garden variety alcoholism. And that can be true and maybe be helpful for partners as well. But yeah, change is a big deal for all sides of addiction. And also I had a couple recently that one was a drug addict and the other was his partner. And partner was the one that actually initiated treatment and engaging counseling and things like that. But when the addict started to get well, the partner was confused at his own actions. He found himself kind of being a little resistant and irritated. And what we discovered in that dynamic, and this is not typical for everybody, but the partner was actually experiencing some feelings. He was very happy that his husband was recovering, but he also had been used to kind of running the house. That he had a partner who was not present. The guy was there living, breathing, but he didn't have any input on or interest in how the household was run or a piece of art they might want to buy or if they wanted to paint the second bedroom a different color. And suddenly he had a person who had opinions and thoughts, and that was an adjustment for him. That was a change. And it was one he welcomed because his partner was there again. He was present. But nevertheless, it was a change and something he had to really work on. And it was unexpected.
Yeah. And any change requires adjustment, even the ones we want. We've got a question here. In the early stages of recovery, would you advise that it's in the best interest of the addict to go into the change process solo, meaning without being in it says the relationship or a relationship?
So let's see. So I think in general, and not talking about relationships for a moment, I think an addict shouldn't do much of anything alone. I think that idea of normalizing peers and experiences and groups and social connection is extremely important. I mean, I probably still, many years into recovery, my thinking can get kind of screwy sometimes, and I think I need that feedback to kind of get me back in my lane and feeling grounded again. So I think that's true across the lifespan of recovery, probably especially true in early recovery where people maybe don't have points of reference and kind of a healthier way of doing it or much experience under their belt to do that. So, so I think going into change solo in that regard is never a good idea. Scott, did you say there was something about a relationship in there? Oh, I see. I see the bottom there. Solo meaning
relationship. Yeah.
Okay. So my feeling on this is that if someone gets into recovery solo, they should stay solo for a while. A relationship is the last thing somebody needs, whether they're a sex addict or an alcoholic or a drug addict or anything else, because a relationship really just kind of provides all kinds of distraction and externalizing and other problems. And I think one of the things that's important to do in early recovery is to simplify. And starting a new relationship is hard. It's exciting and wonderful, but it's hard and it's a distraction. So I think if someone's not involved in a relationship, there's that wisdom about not getting into a relationship for a year. And that's not a rule. It's not hard science, but it sure is based on a lot of experience over, more than 50 years of people. So I think I pay attention to that stuff because I don't want to make that mistake. Now, having said that, I did get in a relationship my first year. So apologies. It worked out. I was with him for 22 years, but I don't recommend it. So do what I say, not what I do. So, but anyway, and I'll tell you, I was just over a year actually, but it was hard. And I thought, I'm totally ready for this. I want this. And it was challenging than I thought. So I do believe in that 1 year mark. If you're in a relationship already, I also think it's important not to make huge changes right away. It may be that people, and that depends, of course, on where the couple has come before that recovery piece. But in general, I just kind of like to kind of freeze the action and have everybody go to their corners and start getting some help and evaluate over time. Because I think almost always a decision I make in early recovery is probably not going to be the one I make 6 months down the road or a year down the road. And that includes getting involved with somebody. I could find the most wonderful person in the world, and after my first 30 days of program, and that's probably not the person I would choose when I had my second year. So I think those kind of changes are really important to be cautious about. Now, there are situations that are just so intolerable where there's been such damage to the relationship. I understand that sometimes separation, space need to be done. But I really encourage that to be done with the help of a third party, and usually a professional who can kind of monitor and guide and assist with that process. Because I also know that sometimes there's a great urge to like get this piece of you-know-what out of my life, be gone. And then the very next day, there might be a feeling of, oh, gee, I really need that person. I want them back. So there's a lot of ups and downs that I think we need to let kind of calm down, let the feelings get expressed and dealt with before we implement, go to the nuts and bolts of creating change in our relationships.
You know, what I always tell people I'm working with who ask questions like that is addicts, when we walk in the room, we are emotionally fragile. We've had a coping mechanism for a very long time, whether it was alcohol or drugs or sex or whatever, you know, whenever we had a feeling, we knew how to deal with it. Well, that's no longer in our life. So now every time we have a feeling, we don't know how to deal with it because we've spent our entire lives not dealing with our feelings. You know, in relationships, starting a relationship or ending a relationship, either way, is incredibly stressful. It's incredibly emotional, good emotions, bad emotions, and we're usually not ready to handle it. You know, I've seen more people go out over, oh, I met the perfect person and we're dating, and then 3 days later, you know, they're not dating, and they both go out, you know, and they both relapse and they stay out for 6 months. I've also seen lots and lots of people who spent the entire first year of their sobriety bitching about their spouse nonstop. And everybody just knew at the end of a year they were going to break up, but then 5 years later, they're still together. And the addict is so grateful that his or her partner stuck with them and gave them a chance to recover and work through all of the emotions. So that's really the reason that you know, they kind of say, you know, you're going to make a major change. You're getting rid of your addiction, but you know, don't change jobs. Don't change your relationship status. You know, that little button on Facebook, leave it alone for a year. You know, because you're just too fragile to handle the emotions and stay sober.
And there are so many changes that come at people, both partners and addicts, in early recovery. I mean, it's just every day is a change of some sort. That it's really is all the it stretches the capacity to deal with it to its maximum. And I think to add more that we don't have to deal with is really a mistake.
And yeah, and then there's so much. And one of the things that what was so unexpected for me was that my social life was going to change completely. Now, I knew I wasn't going to be drinking or using or acting out sexually, but I didn't realize the people were going to completely change. I didn't realize that, you know, and if I had a partner at that time, how hard would that have been for my partner if we socialized together and had mutual friends who were unhealthy for me? You know, not only would I have had to deal with that, but a partner would have. And just the way I was spending my time, and, you know, again, a partner would have had to deal with that. Suddenly I want to play Monopoly. Really? This is not the guy I married.
Right.
There's so many weird things that are unexpected that change, whether it's external or internal.
Right. In a totally unpredictable way too. It's really hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And I think for me, and I think probably for most addicts, when I was really bottoming out, it was so chaotic that I was kind of really grasping for instability, and that became kind of a rigidity of my pattern and not wanting to budge off my addiction for the reason that was my coping mechanism. That was how I dealt with everything, and it was fear of I would literally kind of fall apart and not be able to cope without that. I really believe that.
And I see that a lot, not just with addicts who utilize chaos as a way to get out of their head and get out of their feelings, but partners of addicts who've gotten used to the chaos. And if they're dealing with the chaos, they don't have to deal with the underlying problem. And chaos can be its own, escapist, sort of maladaptive coping mechanism.
Definitely. Chaos, drama. Yeah, same thing, I guess. Just all that swirl of stuff. Yeah, for sure.
Which is one of the reasons is Dr. Rob, who says, good recovery is just one step above boring, or he talks about the slow dopamine drip instead of the big hits, the big rush. That is what recovery tends to morph into, but it doesn't happen overnight.
For sure. And I also want to say it's not, of course, everybody on this webinar is somehow attached to an addiction or person who's an addict, but I'm sure that would sound really kind of uninteresting for people. But my life is, I don't have the drama or chaos to any great extent, but I love it. It's a very rich life. There's room for creativity, and there's room to meditate and ask myself the miracle question and evaluate my purpose and what I'm doing, and just so it has meaning in a way that was totally lacking when my addiction was active. And so I think that's been one of the huge gifts. It looks and feels different. It's not this frantic. My addiction was either a kind of a frantic pace or this really gloomy depression, and I don't have either of those anymore, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
Maybe people could share with us, whether you're an addict or a partner, changes that you've made that you're happy with, unhappy with, were surprised by. I'm curious about the changes people are experiencing, and maybe if you use the chat feature, the Q&A feature, tell us how long sober you are or your partner's sober. That would be kind of cool to see what people are doing. A weird change for me, for instance, when I walked into recovery, the last thing in the world I wanted was a spiritual connection. Just not on my radar at all. And I would read those parts of the steps and I would think, no, not for me. I didn't even want to get sober. I just wanted my consequences to stop, which didn't happen. Still had to live through all of that. But somewhere along the way, through working the steps and learning to be connected to other people in a healthy way as part of my recovery, I got this sense of something outside of myself that was important. And that may or may not sound like a spiritual connection to other people, but for me, realizing I'm not in charge of everything, other people matter too, is kind of a spiritual awakening. Not what I showed up for. Unexpected change, part external, part internal, slow. But it's one of the things that I'm most grateful for at this point. My life is richer and better. So I'd love to hear what other people have to say. Maybe David could share one while we wait for you to type. You're all quiet today. Come on.
Yeah, it's quite a group. This is interactive, folks. So yeah, I had this spirituality thing too. I was very resistant to that. For me, though, a bigger one early on was, well, I was just an incredibly isolated person. I was in the middle of New York City, and in the middle of millions of people. I had a job, which is my denial. I used to tell myself I never missed a day of work, which I didn't, but I probably wasn't very effective on most days at work. But I would go home and drink and drug at home. I was not a bar drinker. I was not a social drinker. So by the time I bottomed out, I was extremely isolated and lonely, and really didn't know kind of how to handle people. And the big change for me early on was just surrounding myself with people. And it was overwhelming, actually, at first. So I had to kind of really be careful with myself. But quickly I learned, my God, this is what I've been craving. I was so isolated and lonely, and just that to have somebody to go to coffee with, or somebody to talk to, or just somebody to be in a room with. We're not even chatting. Because I was a drinker at home, I was afraid to go home. So I would go to 2 and 3 meetings a night. I'd start after work and go home at 11 or 12 midnight and drop into bed exhausted and get up, go to work and go to meetings the next day, start the whole routine. But so those evenings, the 6 or 7 hours a day of 12-step program, really the gift of that was to kind of, I felt like I was reborn again. And that sounds kind of dramatic, but I felt like I not just made friends, but made a connection in a way that was really profound. A place of isolation and feeling misunderstood and lonely and unique and all the kind of negative victim-y stuff that we get into as addicts. It just was, what a gift. And I didn't expect that. Like you, Scott, just to kind of get the consequences to go away. For me, it was just to kind of get the pain and physical damage that was occurring and emotional damage of the addiction to stop. I wasn't looking for anything else. It's just kind of make it stop. And then all this other stuff started to fill in that space. It was really wonderful, actually.
I think it's kind of interesting that we both, when coming up with an aspect of change that was unexpected, mentioned a form of connection, whether it's with the higher power or other people or both. And that is Johann Hari, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, has a TED talk called "Addiction is the Opposite of Connection."
You know addiction is wrong, or
yeah, everything you know about addiction is wrong. But basically, he presents it as addiction is an intimacy disorder. We are afraid of other people. We don't want to ask other people for help. We don't want to be vulnerable, show our weaknesses. And so we turn to alcohol or drugs instead, or whatever, as a way to avoid this unmet need. We have a comment, I think in response to my question earlier. Realizing I needed to set personal boundaries for myself, yes, to keep myself from drinking. Couldn't spend time with certain people who I knew would be gossiping about me, or not go to parties where drinking and drugs were prevalent. What I didn't expect is my husband tried really hard to make me feel guilty and ashamed for needing to avoid people and parties because he didn't want to stop our lifestyle. He actually called me selfish.
Wow. Yeah, that's a painful little paragraph right there, but I think that is not unusual. I remember early on when somebody was describing family systems of addiction, like a series of, oh God, I'm trying to think of the modern artist who does those things that hang and they're all in perfect balance. If you could just picture even coat hangers hanging kind of all in balance. If you tug on one or change one, everything else gets affected, right? The balance is very subtle, but one little change changes everything. And I think that's what you're really describing in real on-the-ground terms with that scenario, is that our partners are impacted by this as well, and sometimes resent the changes that they feel they have to make. But I think your very first sentence there is hugely important about really setting personal boundaries and deciding to do what's right for you. And There's been times when I tell my partner, okay, you do what's right for you. I'm going to do what's right for me. And that may be not going to a party. It may not be doing a certain event. It may not be going around a friend of his that I find challenging. So those kind of decisions. And at first I thought, okay, if we don't do everything in lockstep, tandem, attached at the hip, it's going to be a problem. And I discovered actually it's much healthier for us to kind of do our thing sometimes and come together as a strong couple. We don't have to be together all the time. And it was really important for me, as it sounds like for you, to really to identify my needs, which is a challenge sometimes because I didn't really know what I needed. But to figure that out and then really set it out. And I think good for you. Good for you. And I think that kind of partner behavior does occur. I think they're dealing with their own anxiety and fear, and it's a big change. It's a big imposed change on our partners, just as the addiction is. So, yeah, good for you. So there's a little follow-up there.
I think the artist you were talking about was Alexander Calder. Yeah, we're not going to read that little bit.
Just say the boundaries were asserted strongly. Yeah. Okay.
And one of the reasons, learning to set boundaries is a huge change for most addicts in recovery, and also partners whose addicted partner gets into recovery. You've had one set of probably very dysfunctional boundaries where one person is controlling the other, or there's over enmeshment and there's fear, and it's just driven by all sorts of dysfunctional things, and then suddenly that needs to change.
I want to say one more thing about that, because that whole selfish piece, for me as an addict, and I suspect for partners who are asserting themselves, every move, every decision I made, or every action I took that I determined was the right thing to do for me in my recovery felt extremely selfish. It didn't, and it felt self-indulgent. And I realized that had to do with my really low self-worth and not deserving anything. And so I think for a long time, my ability to recognize, am I being selfish or am I just taking care of myself? That was really blurry for me. And so that's where that was another example, and there's many, where I needed other people to kind of provide a barometer for me, a mirror. I needed a sponsor, I needed friends to say, no, this is okay, or no, you're really overstepping the boundaries there, just to get feedback, because I had my internal gauges were all screwy, and they remained that way a long time.
Yeah, we don't become addicts because we're well or make good decisions. We've got another question here. I transitioned from being somewhat of a partner into setting boundaries to be a friend. I then became the accountability police per the addict's request. And then I was pushed away completely and all communication ceased. I've been transitioning with this situationship. I love that. Situation and relationship. For quite a long time. I struggled with being nothing after having a purpose. However, I'm seeking help with understanding and taking care of me. I cannot control the addict's choices and behavior, but I can control my reactions to them. I have a deep love for this person and hope healing will come.
That's great. Wonderful. And I think the kind of progression you describe sometimes does happen with relationships, friendships, in recovery as people change, and for better or for worse, those things happen, and it's extremely painful if we're not on the same page with someone we care about, and that in terms of the level of intensity and intimacy for the relationship. So I think I'm so glad to see that you took care of yourself, because that's really all we can do. We're powerless over anybody else in our lives, really, and especially an addict. And I think they're going to do what they feel they have to do, and I think it's incumbent on anybody affected by them to do what they need to do for themselves as well. It's just really important. And also, again, you say you're seeking help with understanding. You're probably finding benefit, as I did, of some outside feedback and guidance for those things, because it was very confusing for me. when those kind of things happened with friendships, or when there were changes, when people drifted, when people disappeared, I personalized everything, and as we tend to do, I think. And most times when I found out what actually happened, it had nothing to do with me, but it didn't feel that way. And so I think we really had to learn how to deal with the feelings and take care of ourselves no matter what. And that can feel harsh and self-indulgent, but I think that's really the bottom line for a lot of those behaviors.
Yeah, that was really a loving statement, I thought. I do want to pick out one line, and I'm going to ask David to address this. I struggle with being nothing after having a purpose. Yeah,
that line carries quite a punch. So I think so often when we get involved with addicts, or even as addicts ourselves, but I think it's profoundly true with partners, our relationship with them, taking care of them, loving them, caring about them, protecting them, becomes our purpose. It kind of hijacks our lives in a way that we get very frustrated with, we get very resentful about, but it is all consuming. And I think just like an addiction, and it's a really, I think, accurate parallel, with me as an addict, or Scott was describing this too, it takes, dozens of hours each week, 10, 12 hours a day, pursuing, thinking about, or whatever, but active in our addictive process, in that cycle. That's a huge amount of time and effort. And to just remove that requires a huge adjustment. And I think it's the same thing with a partner who has become involved, sometimes over-involved, maybe even obsessed with, out of loving care, somebody they care about. If that changes all of a sudden, that has become their purpose, and that suddenly they're feeling kind of at odds. What am I all about? That's where that stage we talked about, the enter the possibilities stage, the third one, where we kind of have to really take a step back and say, well, what is my purpose? What's meaningful for me? And I think it's a good thing to, it's never, I'll rephrase it, it's never a good thing to have somebody else be our primary purpose. So I think, and that's often the situation partners find themselves in. So I think it's important to, if that happens, of course there's going to be a void. But I think it's really important then to cultivate what's important for you and what gives you meaning. And that's easier said than done. But I think we know that living with purpose is one of those things that increases lifespan, increases quality of life. And I mean, there's all kinds of real world applications of living with purpose. So, but that was a change for you, right? From having a person be your purpose to having that be removed, which maybe is something to be grateful for. It may not feel that way at the time, but it provided an opening for you to make a change. So.
I would also add, kind of the flip side of that is it's not wrong to love and care for an addict or anybody else who's struggling. Good people do that. That's what good people naturally do. There's language out there, codependency language, that will tell you, staying with an addict, continuing to care for an addict, that it's pathological. There's something wrong with it, and there isn't. There may be better ways to go about it. You may need to engage in self-care, the things David was talking about when he initially responded to this question. But I would encourage you not to let anybody tell you you did something wrong or you're doing something wrong by continuing to care for this person, because you're not. We feel how we feel, and we want to help who we want to help. And it hurts when someone doesn't want our help or doesn't want us in their life anymore. But, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with us because we want to stay there or be there.
Right. And I think that, this is a nugget of a paragraph. The last sentence you said, I have a deep love for this person and hope healing will come. I think, and that's the beauty and that's the gift of that work. I think if we can kind of let go of expectations, let go of the person and take care of ourselves. And that's the point at which for me, I guess, grace, higher power, gratitude, kind of wishing the best for that person. That for me is healing. And that's where I want to go in my relationships.
Yeah, the new approach that, well, Dr. Rob wrote a book called Prodependence, Moving Beyond Codependency. And his approach and his belief is, people who try to help addicts are heroes. They're not pathological, they're heroes. And let's celebrate that and work with that. Teach these individuals, if they need to learn how to engage in self-care, great. Let's work with them on that. If they need to be, know when to pull back and when to push forward, work with them on that, help them be more effective in their efforts or whatever. But don't tell them there's something wrong with them, because there isn't. You can't love too much. You just can't. It's not possible. I don't think.
Right.
So.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we have you all are very quiet today, but we filled an hour, no problem, because David and I like to talk, but me especially. But David, do you want to wrap up a little summary of change before we sign off for the evening?
Well, there's a quick comment, which maybe we can deal with another time, because that may take more time than I have. In terms of wrapping up change, I would just say, it's difficult, but it's totally predictable. It's going to happen. And I think we need to recognize it when it comes and honor it and not resist it, and really see if there's any nuggets in there that work for us and embrace it. And I think embracing change is not easy. It's a challenge, but there are many, many gifts in it. And I will tell you, many changes that I felt were imposed on me that I really felt resentful about turned out to be some of the greatest gifts in my life. And so I think you never know when it happens, what's going to be.
Yeah, I hear in meetings all the time, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So if we want our lives to be better, we have to make changes. And changes are going to, yeah, David's right, change happens whether we like it or not.
Right.
So we do have a question about healthy detachment, but let's hold off and save that one for next week.
Thank you.
Because that's a really big issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, several talks on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Know that we do this webinar now every week at this time. Tell your friends, and please keep coming back.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Scott. Take care. Good night.